Actually, I do have
Or for me, we were in Lake Orion.
coffee.
My mom has two
Taylor.
sisters.
Well, grow up, I'm not sure, but Harbor now.
Knowledge that they're now in.
Okay.
That's a little more than stuffing crops.
I'm good, I'm fine. And I'm
All right.
We're gonna go ahead and get started, everybody.
Have you got the list?
there is still enjoyment.
I think we're ready for,
Yep. Through the chair, we have Deputy Clerk Dave Mavia tonight.
Just gotta get there, you gotta get to the
we're
seat.
doing roll call.
Staff.
Here.
Here.
Lozano.
Here.
Savoy. Rolo. Here. Ziegler.
Here. Would you like me to do?
Yeah, we need approval of agenda and then, yes, approval of the minutes.
All right, I need a motion to approve the agenda. I see Dave is, all right, thank you.
Second.
Seconded by Jeffrey. All in favor? All right, motion carries. And a motion to approve last meeting's minutes. Motion to approve by Kimberly,
Second.
seconded by Jeffrey. All in favor? Motion carries. All right.
If I protested, what would happen?
Going to be really good about using mics tonight, and we're going to be really good about saying through the chair. Thank you, Dale, for reminding us. So we have both topics that we discussed at the last meeting on the agenda today. We have both expenses as the first half of the meeting, and then we have introduction to revenue options as the second half of the meeting. What we really want to do is give you all the broad view of all the possible potential paths to success, and then kind of start winnowing down beginning in December, talking about what options maybe we can remove entirely because nobody is enthusiastic. Maybe there are new ideas that we want to explore, etc. But starting from a place of having all the information out on the table before we get too detailed into one lane. So that's the way we're going to spend our time, half and half. We do have guests here, Eric. He's going to help us by being able to run scenarios with the software that is used. Importantly, in talking about tonight and making sure you understand that it would be, should you recommend an expense that no millage or there were to be required cuts, those decisions would be made by the city council and the city at the city manager's recommendation. So you all don't need to recommend specific cuts if you do choose to recommend expense cuts. So just wanted to make sure you understand that. And we want to understand how would the city council go about that so that if that were to be your recommendation, you have a sense of what that might look like in terms of the decision-making process. We do have a bit of a follow-up on some of the questions that have been asked along the way that we've documented, and Joe has done a good job of keeping track of some of the things you've requested in terms of additional information, for example, on efficiencies and things that the city has already pursued. So we're going to have an update on that tonight. We won't have answers to all the questions that have been raised, but we'll make sure to answer those questions, if not in December, before January. And then before we get into the content, I did want to open it up. I'm not sure if anybody did their homework. No shame, no blame if you didn't. But if you have had a chance to start talking with some of your neighbors or your friends about what you've been learning, we'd welcome any questions that have surfaced, ideas that have surfaced, key themes that you've heard. So would anybody like to start?
So I had an interesting conversation with a resident, and we were actually talking about the facilities task force recommendations. And this particular resident, her priority was maintaining and preserving existing buildings. And I said, well, what if that's more expensive? And she said, to me, the priority is maintaining our buildings, our history, all of that sort of thing. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. I mean, that is one resident, so that's an anecdote, not a data set. But yeah, that's a conversation that I had with someone. Anybody else want to share any conversations that they've had with people? Okay.
This on?
Should be.
You sure? Great. So I was able to talk to about 5 people regarding, their perception of if their tax were high and believe that they're receiving excellent services or acceptable services for their. And a couple of individuals said that they don't really pay too much attention to their taxes, their mortgage, and they don't really feel like they're impacted by it. And one said that they would definitely vote yes to override the Headley. Another individual said that their taxes were way too high. I was looking for our guest that said that he's going to be here. Rest the same. And other individuals were very interested in like what's happening with the Kulik Center with regard to future development. Nothing really terrible except for the 2 that said they're high.
So it's kind of an interesting a perception that I get back from folks, and it's almost younger folks that have recently moved here essentially say their taxes are way too high, they can't believe it, and when their kids get school age or so, they're going to move to Rochester or something along those lines. Older people that have been here for a long time usually say that they have like a dilemma in their mind. Like they feel like their property taxes are getting too high, but they're manageable. But from my perspective, when I hear that, I think to myself, this upcoming year they're going to get an increase of 5%, right? Because that's what it is. It's 5% or the rate of inflation. So this upcoming year, they're all going to get 5%. And then they're going to be reminded by this talk of the Headley override. And from my perspective, it seems kind of hard to digest that one of the things that keeps their property taxes low, whether they understand it or not is one thing. But one of the things that keeps their property taxes low is going to come into question, and they, are sensitive to that because most of the time, older people are on closer to fixed incomes, and they've probably been here for a long time. So no matter what you tell them, they're going to say, you can't tell me that my property taxes are not going to go up because of this. And so if they were to go up, I think it's really important that there's everything that in the power that the city has, every tool that they have to reduce the likelihood of having that question put forth is probably really important, because 5% increase and then all of a sudden you want to override this. That's just my thoughts and experience speaking with people about this.
I just want to go on the record. I did forget to mention that I had a conversation previously a while back, and they said, taxes are high, and I'm definitely leaving Ferndale if, the Headley is overridden. So they're just, it's difficult for them to rationalize the tax burden on their budget. So, yeah, I just wanted to put that on record.
Chair. So I unfortunately haven't had a chance to talk to my neighbors at all yet about this committee specifically, but over the years we've talked, not just my neighbors, but other residents of Ferndale, and I have talked about property taxes and how generally they feel that they are very high. And that there's a huge discrepancy. You know, that meeting we had with the Oakland County equalization team, where they use those two houses as an example right next door to each other, where one pays about half in property. Like, that's literally my scenario with my next door neighbor. She's been there since the 50s and she pays less than half, and our houses are identical. Like, they were built by the exact same builder, everything. All that to say, I think that one of the things that has really stuck out to me about what we've learned so far here is just how much of those dollars actually go to the city, and how much of it does not, how much of it leaves the city to go to the state and to the county, and how much we don't really see back. And so I understand and I completely empathize with folks who are like, if they go up anymore, we have to leave. Like, you can only, you can't afford what you can't afford. But I think that's just something that's gonna be really important for us to consider as we like have these conversations with people, is like reminding them of exactly how much of it is staying within the city, because it's not like every single penny that they pay is staying in the city of Ferndale, and the city of Ferndale keeps asking for more.
I did. Quick. Hi, I spoke with 4 of my neighbors. They all agreed that they wanted the same city services, and they did want to see the changes that the previous committee had put forward. They don't think if we push to raise taxes that most people would vote for that. And they were interested in something I asked our city manager last meeting, which was, can we raise the Hadley? So they would be more interested in, I guess, a higher Hadley than actually raising taxes. And that's what I got.
I wasn't at the last meeting, so I'm interested in that, what Jeffrey just said about that conversation that came up. I'll ask Joe afterwards. And so also didn't know our homework assignment, sorry. But we'll share that over this summer and fall, doing door knocking for city council and mayoral candidates, that there's it feels like a general unsettledness about expenses, taxes, economy. So I think the clearer that we can be in communicating, is it an increase? What does a continuation or a renewal mean? You know, this was something that was really important with the school bond renewal that just happened too. You know, that we're taking it out further, but dollar-wise, it'll be the same, you know, that sort of messaging, and or having something exciting that you're getting out of it. So with the school bond, you know, our district got this humongous investment in a new elementary school, which is so exciting for us. Investments in existing buildings, and like, that was exciting sort of things for us to think about and look forward to. So if there's something, you know, given the recommendations of the facilities task force, I know there are many things, but if there's something that, you know, is exciting and can be looked forward to as part of this conversation and this balance, I think that then people will know what their money is going toward, as opposed to just these sort of amorphous general operating dollars, which is always hard to talk about.
We'll turn it over to Joe, I think, first to introduce.
Thank you. Good reflections. Appreciate everyone doing their homework. I want to begin tonight with just a follow-up from our November 9th meeting. We do have Eric Fabian here, who's with Resource X, to just kind of essentially lead a Q&A and a follow-up on priority-based budgeting. We walked through and I'll just I know Kate was gone, so I'll go back to that. On the November 9th meeting, we wanted to make sure that we followed up on our budget introduction meeting, introducing how we would handle scenario planning should there be a major revenue disruption. And so the things that we wanted to communicate is that we align our budget around outcomes and that we budget for priorities and programs. And in doing so, we don't do flat percentage across the board cuts because those are arbitrary and we don't really understand what those impacts mean. So the thing that we wanted to communicate, as Brittany said to the committee, is we do have a logic for how we would approach this. And ultimately, whatever happens, the city manager's office is tasked with passing or recommending a budget to council. Council's responsible for passing it and asking questions of the city manager in terms of how they would recommend should resources change. So with that, we went through all of the different lenses and all of the different scoring rubric of the software. And I could get us just far enough to where I couldn't quite get into the depth of your questions. And I thought it would be best to hear from the subject matter expert themselves. So with that introduction, Eric, I don't have a bio, but he's amazing. So Eric Fabian.
Do I need to talk into this? Okay, whoops. Okay, I'll get there. I appreciate it. So thank you, Joe, for the introduction. Thank you, Finance Committee, for your interest in priority-based budgeting itself and for this thoughtful conversation on the challenge ahead of this community, quite honestly. So my name's Eric Fabian with ResourceX, as Joe mentioned. I'm our Customer Success Director, which means I engage with organizations like yours in their application and implementation of program and priority-based budgeting. So ResourceX has been around for about a decade. We've worked with approximately 300 or so local government organizations across North America, both cities and counties and school districts and special districts, to really understand how resources are invested in the programs and services that you provide and how to associate data and considerations above and beyond a line item perspective into a program perspective. And while the line item budget will never go away, that's important and has value, we're trying to get a little bit more upstream from there to really translate a line item budget, which oftentimes has objects such as tools and fuel and uniforms and training, into mutually understood from a resident and staff and council perspective conversation around those programs and activities that you deliver. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish from a implementation perspective is how do we translate those line items into those programs and services that the city delivers? What does it cost? What's the true cost of delivering those programs and services? And if there's a revenue component, we want to understand that cost recovery as well. And then what other measurement or scoring can we apply to those programs and services to inform future decision making? And so, I do applaud Ferndale and your engagement in this type of budgeting methodology. It's supported not only by a variety of, dare I say, more dynamic organizations who really want to have a different lens for financial consideration and decision making, but also by organizations like GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, and ICMA, International City County Management Association, which are the two largest local government membership organizations across North America, and also really provide that thought leadership that a lot of local governments look to when they're looking to elevate how they approach these types of decisions. So I do understand that the presentation on November 9th provided kind of an overview of the work that Joe and his team and council have engaged in around this budgeting methodology and some of the data that has come out to date. And, you know, I'm certainly here to provide any additional context around how to go about this work, how Ferndale has implemented program and priority-based budgeting to date, what the data might be telling us, or what different scenarios we may be able to look at, and any other questions that you may have.
Maybe we could start with the questions that came up at the last meeting that we weren't able to answer. The first of which is, how are scores tabulated?
So that's a good question, and it's a complex answer to some degree. So I'll start from the base root of how they're tabulated. So I think during the presentation on November 9th, you were provided, or at least in the presentation, there was a view of.
I think he's going to pull up the slide on that.
Okay. There was a perspective of programs and how they were scored across what we call 5 core basic program attributes. And those revolve around, is the program mandated? What is the cost recovery of that program? What's the trend on demand for that program, population served, and reliance? And so as part of the process, and let me take a step back, those basic program attributes are recommended by ResourceX that each organization score their programs against. And we kind of call that metadata because it's important to know, and you can also start to compare and contrast combinations of that data, such as, is a program not mandated and demand is decreasing and there's no cost recovery? That set of programs might be elevated for further conversation in an environment of fiscal challenge to say, do we need to continue to do these, given that we're not mandated to do so? Demand is decreasing, we're not recovering costs. You might want to consider population served if it's only 10% or less. It's not serving the majority of the community. And it's not to say those are bad programs. I don't want to say that at all. There could be a very good reason why those programs are being delivered and benefiting the community, but they at least demand additional conversations around them to really justify their continuation given those metrics and combinations of scores. And so Joseph has brought up, appreciate that, just another view of those 5 core basic program attributes. And so as we can see, there's, let me navigate through here if I can, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm a Mac user, so I'm gonna revert back to the mouse. This is static, but that's okay. So I'll ask you to look at the mandate in the upper left-hand corner, and we can see that there's 3 options for scoring a program. There is no mandate. There is a self-mandate or ordinance, meaning the city is the owner of that mandate and may have an opportunity to release that mandate. And then there's state or federal mandate. And it's important to understand what level of mandate, if one exists, to understand where you have potential flexibility. And even if a program has a state or federal mandate, oftentimes, you know, this story around the program gets passed down from generation to generation within an organization. And, you know, after 10 to 20 to 50 years of delivering this program that everyone believes is state or federally mandated, it's considered Teflon and you can't change a thing. And that's not always the case. One example might be from a county who's mandated to provide, license plates to residents. So if you look at that mandate, it might not say 8 convenient locations with a wait time or 30 seconds or less at each location. It might just say they need to deliver license plates, and that might just be an online delivery system. So I give that example to say, even if a program's mandated, it's important to understand the extent to understand your true flexibility there. From a demand perspective,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry.
Are there questions on that? And I think you were getting actually at the second question too, so I appreciate the detail. And I think this question in particular, they understood at a high level the different categories and the weights. I think what they were struggling with is you couldn't just do the math of, okay, it gets a 2 because it's self-mandated and that's weighted twice, and then, 2 times 2 plus 3 times 1 plus,
Yep.
and then it didn't equal 83.
Right.
So, yes, Kimberly, please.
Through the chair. I did have one question about, so I know that demand is where things get a little squishy, maybe. And Joe, in your email, you had said and we talked about this at our last meeting, you encourage departments to justify scoring with data. Is there a way to, like, if there are 2 programs that are being considered, to be cut because of low demand, and one program can show, like, objectively demand has been lower because they have quantitative data to show that, and another, is saying, like, well, no, like, they don't have data, but they're saying that demand is a little bit higher. Is there a way to weight the one with data more heavily? Does that make sense? Or is that considered?
Yeah, understood the question and the point, and it's a good one. I would say there is a way to do that. The way that the scores are calculated for Ferndale don't represent that currently. So there is an opportunity to do that, but it's not currently the way that the programs are scored. To the point. I'm sorry.
No, we're going to have lots of questions.
Hey, no problem, no problem.
To the point of, can you answer the calculation?
Right, I was going to do that. Thank you for that. So, as you might imagine, there's an algorithm that's applied to the scoring. And you're correct to observe that if you just add up the scores across these 5 core basic program attributes, it's impossible to get to 80 or 70 or 60. And so what we do in the general sense is we do add up all of the scores across the 5 basic program attributes per program. And then what we attempt to do is normalize those across a 100-point scale. So if a program scores, let's say, 4s across the board, that gets to a 20, and another program gets to a total score of 16 on, we need to look through the lens of how all the 200 plus scores in the Ferndale program inventory were tallied across a 100-point scale, and then normalize them across that, if you will. So you're going to have scores that, in this example, maximized out at 20. You would think that that went to 100 in a normalized 100-point scale perspective, but we're trying to get to a mean, if you will. And so we're also looking at where did the other programs score from a 100-point scale. If there were dozens of them in the 30 to 40 range and dozens of them into the 70, 80 range, for example, we're going to try and create a mean score and spread all the other programs out across that 100-point scale. So if an individual program scored 20, it's still going to be higher on the 100-point scale, obviously. It's not going to be penalized, but it's going to be distributed at that mean average of all the programs that were scored, if that's helpful.
And Quinn, I think that was your question. Did he answer your question for you?
I have no idea what you just said. I'm just
Brooke,
gonna,
Brooke
I am
wants to
looking-
try interpreting.
I
I
am
think
looking
I
around.
think Brooke
Yeah.
might be able to translate.
I am looking around the room, and I don't think one of us really.
Brooke's
you
gonna
be able
try.
to help us with a real world common knowledge example of in which that type of algorithm, mean standardization, all of that sort of thing is common knowledge for the average citizen.
That's challenging, I agree, but let me try and do a visual. And we have somewhere here we are. So we actually do have, a PowerPoint here that attempts to better explain the normalization and means approach to program scoring. I hope that it gets better to the point that maybe I could, but I can tell you that it's still a bit challenging to follow. This slide here starts to perhaps visualize what we're hoping to get at. And so when we're looking at this prioritization array, one element that I think is important if you look towards the bottom right side of this slide is the key reference, where we're talking about that programs are grouped into quartiles and not ranked one versus the other. So it's not a competition of one program against another necessarily, because there's 5 basic program attributes that ultimately make up a program's total score. And so while there's value in understanding that total score, I would suggest that there's also equal, if not more, value in understand a program score versus each individual basic program attribute, such as mandate, demand, population served, versus the total score. But I don't want to eliminate the value of that either. Does the concept of programs are not ranked directly one versus the other, but are trying to be grouped across the spectrum of scores against other programs help a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm looking here. I happen to have a printout of the final scores for a bunch of the programs. And as I'm looking through this, I see a whole bunch that are exactly 91.67, and I see a whole bunch that are 83.33, which are obviously, groups. It appears to be groups. So let me say this in my words, and let's see if we're tracking the same. So we take all of the programs, we rank them on the maximum of 20 or 25 or whatever the potential straight score would be, adding up all of those things together. They get a rank, and then we chunkify those into 4 quartiles, and everything in that quartile, whether it's the top of the quartile or the bottom of the quartile, gets the same final score on this prioritization. Does that sound about right?
You're 95% of the way there.
That's a lot closer than I was before.
Yes. So I would say the only caveat I would say is that not all programs that fit into quartile 1 are going to have the exact same score, but they are going to have the top quartile ranking, so they could be scored from, let's say, 100 to 75, and that would still represent quartile 1. 74 to 50 would be quartile 2. Now, those quartiles can be adjusted based on an organization's desire, but I know that Ferndale hasn't adjusted theirs. They've taken Resource X best practice recommendation to establish those quartiles, and they resemble that 100 to 75 kind of ranking or spectrum of scores that would represent quartile 1 programs.
What is the reason that there's an exception to quartile 1, that some of those programs have a separate score?
The exception being that they could span from 100 to 75, for example?
Yeah, because like I am seeing there's one program on here that has a score of 100, which is utilities. That makes sense to me. Utilities, very important. We got to keep the lights on.
Yep.
But I don't see anything else that's 100 on here. So presumably that's sort of an exception to everything in quartile 1 having the same score.
Mm-hmm. And why would that be different from other programs?
From other quartiles, yeah.
Right. From other programs or other quartiles?
Other programs in the other quartiles.
Okay. It's going to vary upon how those programs were individually scored across those 5 basic program attributes. So there could be one program has a mandate of 0, one program has a mandate of 2, which would be a self-mandate. One program has a score of 4, which is state or federal mandate. So depending upon how those programs scored across those 5 BPAs, basic program attributes, and what the final tally was, would determine how its total score was calculated, and then there's the normalization process versus how all the other programs were scored.
So looking at the quartile versus priority, looking at all of these different quartiles showing that none of them have the exact same score on this chart, correct?
On the chart, that is correct. That may not accurately reflect
Okay.
Ferndale's program score results.
And does the program score equal the final score from the data that Quinn has referenced?
The final score of each individual program aligns with its quartile rank.
Okay, so if multiple programs have the same exact final score, such as 16.67, they may be in the same quartile. They may have a different ranking for each of the attributes. They could have the same final score. They could be in the same quartile. They may not be in the same quartile, depending on where on this chart they land. Over here, over on the ends, or somewhere along this bell curve type thing.
They're going to have a lot more in common than not. So if individual programs with similar or the same final score, they very likely will be in the same quartile.
So Ferndale's graph, let's say, would look more like a staircase than a gently sloping hill, upside down. Because you're going to have some that are the same score.
I think that's fair to say.
Are we good with the tabulation? Can we move on to the next question? Okay, Dave.
And I understand that it's perhaps unnecessarily complicated, but so I do appreciate you staying with me on that.
Yeah.
But there is a method to the madness. But at the end of the day, while the ultimate quartile ranking has value, I don't want to dismiss that it's equally as important to understand each individual program score within the 5 basic program attributes as well. Because once you get to that granular level of understanding, is a program mandated or not, versus where it lands on the quartile graph, whether it's mandated or not, and its individual score across the other basic program attributes are going to inform decisions more than where it lands on the quartile ranking.
Okay. And I do just want to note we have 16 minutes on expenses left, so we got to be real efficient.
Okay.
All right. Can we let Dave go because he was waiting, and then Kimberly? Yep.
Okay.
No, it didn't. Sorry, can I just real quick? I'll be quick, I promise. So just to confirm, this is not Ferndale data that we're looking at. This is just a sample,
On
correct?
that screen.
This here.
Correct. On the screen is sample, not Ferndale data.
The Ferndale stuff from last meeting, I think.
Yes, okay. So, and then, am I understanding correctly that mandated programs, federally or state mandated programs, do not always necessarily fall in the priority one, like that first quartile? Is that correct?
That score in and of itself would not necessitate a quartile 1 ranking. Correct. It's the tally across all of the basic program attributes. Correct.
Okay, Dave?
I think the question that we had last time, and
Yes.
maybe you were going to bring it up, and I'm sorry.
I
if
think
I'm
it's next on the
stealing
list,
your
but it
thunder.
was your question, so by all means, go ahead.
So one of the categories is reliance.
Yep.
And on the graph that we were looking at last week, everything in the reliance category is 4, saying that there's only one provider for that, and the city is the only one who could provide that service. And I think the question that we had last time was, how does that 4 get there? Puts it in? Is it just is it something that as we're making budgeting decisions, the manager puts in, or is it something that's just kind of a standard? Like the specific example was the emergency medical services, because other communities outsource that or use somebody else for that.
Yep.
But they all say 4 in ours, and I was curious the impact of putting that 4 in the scoring system, or is that fluid? Could it change based on things in the future or so on?
Yep. Good question. So the act of scoring programs is a physical act. It's performed by humans. And so while I have high confidence that the vast majority of this data and the scores that Ferndale completed is accurate, human errors could occur.
I wasn't suggesting an error. I was just trying to understand how the 4 got there.
Okay.
And if it's something that the city decides to assign, and it's because essentially that 4 drives the scoring up.
Yep.
And if that score was a 2, the score of 50 may be less, or
Right.
and so on.
Yep.
That's all.
So the scoring is not set in stone. And in fact, the best practice that we recommend is that cities review these scores at minimum on an annual basis. Actually, we recommend on an annual basis to see if things do change. Conditions change, new outside providers emerge that may have not ever existed before. And so, yes, there's fluidity to those scores on the basis of frequency of reevaluating them.
And who puts them in initially?
City staff perform that scoring.
Through the
Yeah,
chair,
Brooke.
could I ask Joe, do you know the criteria the city used to give a 4 for that reliance category?
I didn't score it, but I have a hunch. So in that case, the director or the fire chief would submit the program description and then work with, then our assistant city manager to complete the rest of it, scoring criteria. So in this category, there's federal, state mandate, local mandate. I would wager that we are probably contractually obligated or committed for fire and EMS local. Oh, no, I'm just saying, no, I'm just saying in this example, because we have Oakway obligations, we have mutual aid obligations that probably have a definition to service level, so it could have been construed as a local mandate. I don't know that specifically to be true. That would be my guess.
Next question that was asked last time, and this may be more for you, Joe, I'm not sure. But could you speak a little bit about how we know program costs are reasonable? So what are the checks and balances in the budgeting process to know that program costs are reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, they are handled on an annual basis through the budget process. So we have, we look at historical data. We do look at peer trends within the region. Our comp trends, again, Royal Oak might be our north neighbor, but they're not a comparative trend. Madison Heights would be more closely akin to us, Oak Park, Hazel Park, even Berkeley to some degree. So we would look at our comp trends in the budget process. So that budget process really occurs January through April. And we're doing mid-year budget adjustments right now in December. And then in January, we start kicking off the staff internal part of the budget process where we're doing department budget entries in January. And then in February, all the directors have to defend their budget requests to the finance director and the city manager. And then we ultimately, when we present city council, we have a budget workshop, which is a public workshop, typically on a Saturday. We will present council with regional data to compare those costs. So we will have done that homework, and we typically roll that up in the council presentation so they can understand regionally where the revenues lie, generally where the expenses lie, and then we kind of move forward from there. But again, we adopt a priority-based budget too. So there are programs that neighbors around us don't have specific to sustainability. We're the only one with a zero waste manager, for example. So in some programs, they're defined based on outcome and priority, not based on comp.
Questions? Yeah, Alvita? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment. I spent some time doing some homework because I had a lot of questions, and a lot of them are more technical, like regarding funds, special revenue, general fund, enterprise funds, and how these programs roll up into them. And I was looking at the dashboard that was shared, the dashboard, and the visuals there are really remarkable. I mean, the transparency that is available to the public in that dashboard is amazing. I really commend you guys for all of the work because it's there. And that's what's really important to me, not necessarily the methodology of rating, but that the budget is reflected and it is transparent. The public can visit that dashboard and see it. Because I know that over time, these things will change, the numbers will get adjusted, and you'll refine how the budget is reflected. My one question had to do with like how to identify legacy programs, and Eric touched on that beautifully as well. So I have been incredibly impressed with all of the work that's been put into this. For me, it's not the methodology, it's more of like, you know, the chart of accounts and the funds that all of these programs are charged.
Thank you, Alvita. Other questions or comments? So there was one scenario that was requested, and I don't know if we can show it here, but what would happen if all discretionary programs were eliminated? Is that a scenario we can look at?
Probably show that bottom quartile.
I.e. no mandate programs.
We could look at all of the programs that meet the no mandate and at least identify which programs meet that criteria. And then we could, you know, envision what our community might look like without any of those.
I don't think anybody's saying, I want to get rid of all. I think that it was an exercise. People were wondering what is the magnitude of mandated services versus non-mandated services. And I don't know if that's an easy question to answer. I'm gathering maybe it's not as easy as I thought it might be.
It's not. It's pretty contextual. Staff, just cover your ears. This is just an example. We're not mandated to provide communication services. I'm mandated to provide print notices, but I'm not mandated to actively respond to or manage social media or print a newsletter. The community has asked us to do that. The community has asked us to prioritize that through a survey. We brought it back, and I'll touch on that later. But that's an example. That is discretionary. So communications is discretionary. Succession planning is discretionary. Anything above minimum HR law and pension law is discretionary. So that's really what we're talking about, and that's really what where we would have to start asking questions, of these non-mandated services with the adjustment of $4 million, what are the priorities and what are the things that we'll have to look at? Very contextual.
Just to support that question, it's not a crazy question, and it's something that we did back in 2009, 2010, when we were getting ready to do the initial override, not a renewal, but the initial override of the Headley. And I remember very vividly Judge Longo, for example, talking about the programs that are mandated at the court versus the programs that are discretionary. And it was very apparent to the council that all of the programs that we valued in terms of like maintaining the sort of humanity and compassion in our civil society were not mandated, right? So the mandated programs were, very bare bones, and then all of the things that Judge Longo and his staff and county partners and other agency partners brought to the table weren't mandated. So it was a question that has been asked in the past. We did not have fancy software in which to answer it. We actually had department heads come in and answer it, and it felt gross to think about losing some of those things that weren't mandated, but it was an important conversation. So I just wanted to validate the question, I guess. Oh, the one in particular, drug court. So the process of reducing recidivism by working very closely with sort of low-level drug offenders. That this is not mandated. Has wonderful outcomes all across the state. Something Judge Longo in particular has put a lot of time and care into. Could be wiped away, and then you think about some of the costs that might go up because of that, right? And so that conversation really stuck with me, that some of these things that we may not have a mandate for are the things that make this, like I said, sort of a human and compassionate place to live, and perhaps even save us money in the long run.
Other questions, comments on expenses? All right.
Just say
Yes,
one more
please.
thing,
Yeah,
Mr.
please.
Chair. So I really feel, just based on everything that I've looked at, that you're asking the right questions, that this budgeting process and the priority-based outcomes budget, you're setting yourself up to make decisions to cut what can be cut, if it comes to that, in a very fair and equitable way.
So I have a thought about this scenario planning, because it sounds like it's maybe a little bit tricky for the public to kind of do scenario planning from the existing website. But I'm wondering if, for our purposes, would we be interested in an exercise that says, okay, this is the program item, these are the scores across the different categories, this is the budget, this is the revenue, if any, that this brings in. What would you cut to get us to, if the Headley override is not renewed? Pick your poison. And now that's not the mandate of this group, but I think it could be enlightening. But what do we think?
I think we need to know the alternative as well, because whatever the alternative is also carries a cost with it too, right? So it's not just, if we were to take this away, what would happen, right, Quentin? I mean, so we would have to have that information as well, right? Okay.
Why don't we take a break, think about it, and at the end of the meeting, we're going to go over the schedule, and we can talk about that. I know there was also some talk about maybe a survey today via email, or yesterday. So I think we should talk about kind of timing and what, how different things could fit in terms of exercises, activities, surveys, etc. Does that work? Cool. All right, let's take 5, come back together at 7. So maybe not 5, 3.
the video to come back. All right.
There we go. Okay, so the way I wanted to introduce revenues, one, we've been gone since November 9th, and so I want to just briefly, as always, we begin with the mission. So the committee's objectives are really laid out below our focus points, which we just talked. We've been exploring staffing levels and government service levels. We've heard from the task force chair, and we walked through their report. We toured some fire facilities and public safety facilities and the lower level of City Hall. And finally, the third question is property tax implications. That's the last thing we were going to get into. And before we do that, I just want to kind of walk through the objectives. I think there's value in walking through the work done so far to validate the progress we've made. Because sometimes there's so much information it can feel like we're in a quagmire and we're not making the progress, but I think we are. So what we know to be true on objective 1, staffing levels in government service. We budget for outcomes. In 2024, the police, fire, and court represents about 60% of the general fund expenses. Of general fund expenses, 70% are personnel. As we've identified, we're a government, we provide services, we don't create products. So that's pretty typical of any local government mix you'll look at. Last meeting, we identified 206 programs that are provided by the general fund departments. And about 15, the first 15 of those 206 programs assume 50% of the general fund budget. Those 15 programs, a lot of them are under the police, fire, and court. So a lot of which are mandated. So I want to just briefly proof that. So that we budget for outcomes. Our 8 critical success factors are the outcomes that City Council has in their strategic plan. And we align our budget activities and our department organization, our cultural values, our recruitment process around these outcomes. So they're embedded downward through the organization. Looking at our pie chart, we've seen this one before, and as you can see, the police and the fire represent just about half of our pie, and if you add the court, that gives us the remaining 9%, so that gives us 7%, that gives us 60%. On the right side, the smaller pie pieces, those are really anything that's not public safety or court related. And I say that, I want to point an emphasis on this, because I think this is what Quinn might have been leading to in the previous discussion when we talk about the loss of $4 million and what that means. And potentially, you might not like the alternative you get. 60% of our budget is police, fire, and court. It is unavoidable to address a $4 million hole without addressing those departments because of their proportion represented in the general fund. Because 70% of the general fund is people, it is unavoidable to address $4 million budget hole without addressing positions. Talking about efficiencies, I wanted to finish just exploring needs on efficiencies. So there was a question to provide some examples of things that we've done, I would say since 2015, since the millage passed, to really create efficiencies and make sure that we're always thinking ahead of the curve. And so I provided a few good examples from across many departments. One is something we started doing within the last 4 years, and that's digitizing building permit review process. So before that, you had a typical large paper requirement. We had a large storage issue in City Hall. And our CED director has done a great job of really trying to digitize all records. But even before that, our building official lobbied to invest in a giant scanner and essentially just force the digitization of our permit process. So this enables a digital workflow. It gets rid of paper, and ultimately it creates significant process efficiencies. Through that department, they also are able to do a lot of field work because we have mobile workforce technology, and we put that in well ahead of our peers. We started actually We actually were an early adopter in terms of Office 365. They actually introduced that to the government in 14, and we got it in 15 and 16. So 2015, 16, well ahead of everybody else. So we actually reduced our server infrastructure costs, which is quite significant. I think we had 7 servers when I got here. We have 2 now. So that's a significant cost reduction and also utility energy reduction. It requires a lot of mechanical to maintain server and to secure it properly. We actually eliminated the newsletter in favor of digital newsletters. We heard from residents that that was a mistake. So in a poll, predominantly, we're talking like 85% of residents asked us to bring the newsletter back. We still didn't want to bring back the monthly print edition. It's quite costly to not just write the content, but actually print and mail. The mailing is quite significant. So we do provide a quarterly issue. We brought that back in 2021 or 2020, I think? Yeah, 21, after a survey that we received. So you should all be getting those, and I drafted an article that goes in the next one in winter about this committee's work, which we can talk about too. When I first began, we eliminated, for the most part, secretarial or one-dimensional roles, as I would call them, that might have been more of a fit for a different standard time of government that didn't really contemplate a work environment where we have cybersecurity risks, we have digital opportunities, we have robust communication demands and expectations on the internal workforce side, but also with the residents. So we've established a lot of these mobile technology efficiencies quite early on, and we've saved significant resources since then. Most recently, we brought a new city clerk in 2021, and the first thing they did was digitize the FOIA process, which is quite cumbersome. So you can actually log into our open FOIA portal, and you can actually see the number of FOIA requests submitted and processed, but it's quite onerous, and they're daily. But actually, before this digitization, our clerks would have to actually email or meet with directors one-to-one, give them records requests, and they would have to look through all of our print files. They would have to look through whatever digital records that they did have that had been scanned for the past decade. And they would have to communicate kind of one-to-one. Now it's a portal. We share the FOIA request and distribute it out to the right department contacts. All those department contacts are decentralized. They're working on the same FOIA request, and the software allows us to talk to each other and respond to those questions. And then finally, the applicant can kind of see all this, and then whoever submitted the FOIA request gets alerted when it's ready. And they just go to their digital counter. They don't have to come to City Hall anymore to get it. License plate recognition software has been implemented for the parking enforcement team. That was an occurrence through the pandemic, actually. We laid off quite a bit of our parking staff when the downtown shut down for close to a year and a half. And so when we started to bring them back, we couldn't find applicants. So we needed to find a different way to enforce it, because the residents really want the residential parking zone program enforced. That is one area where there's a demand and expectation for consistent enforcement. So what we ended up doing is investing in the technology, and it eliminated the person power to actually do that position. So those are some examples of efficiencies that we've done. Are there any questions on those efficiencies?
Dave, does that meet your needs in terms of that question?
I think it answers, some things that we've done definitely to save costs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what kind of dollar amount you could assign to them, but I mean, I was thinking like, so yes, it answers it, but I think that those items are probably, I have no idea, but I'm saying like, so yeah, that answers it if that's what has been done.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Is there anything, any direction you'd like me to explore further? Because I feel like there's a more in-depth follow-up. Are you looking more macro level, service consolidations, things of that nature?
That's kind of what I was thinking, something along those lines, like before we were doing this, and then we combine the two because they kind of go hand in hand with each other, and therefore the city has saved $500,000 of what we spent last year to provide the same thing is kind of what I was thinking. But I understand these efficiencies and I think they're great. But I was looking for more ideas like we did this and the year before we were doing something different and it has saved the city some money. Because like I said, we're going to the conclusion of this committee may be to go to residents and say, hey, look, we want to override this Headley Act. And I think that it would be great to have some examples of things that we've done, that we've looked in our P&L and said, 4 years ago, we used to do this and now we're doing this and it has saved and it's probably even a better service now. And that's the reason. That's what I was thinking.
Sure.
I'm not saying this didn't answer it, but I was thinking
Sure.
things along those lines.
Talking points almost, examples to convey that city has worked hard to make good use of the
To
funds
make
it
sure
receives.
we don't have to do this.
Right, right.
To say, hey, look, we, I think one of the comments back and forth that I saw this week on the Ferndale forum, a Facebook thing, was about garbage cans and why doesn't the city of Ferndale have garbage cans? And it came back to this. It came back to, well, we're going to see what the finance committee says and what happens with that before we start talking about spending more money on things. But I mean, things, I mean, before we go to, people do pay attention and they do hear these, and it would be great to have some examples to say, we've actually looked in our own backyard and we've said, hey, look, there's this requirement and we've kind of overshot that requirement over the last 3 years just because that's what we've always done in the city of Ferndale. And now we're going to do this and now we need less equipment or less expenditure, less money on an annual basis, I guess.
Yep. Thanks, Dave.
I might be able to, with more time, I might be able to think about what kind of quasi-white paper I could add to the report, where you could point to that in the report. That's drafting time.
Yeah, I'm in my mind, like when we went through expenses and we talked about things that you cut essentially over the past because, we needed a new
Sure.
truck for this and we decided that we didn't because we could make do on what we have. Things like that are quantifiable and
Right.
everyone's comparing it to what this Headley Act is supposedly going to keep
Sure.
as part of our budget, right?
Yep.
So, and yeah, because we keep saying it's a revenue problem, and it's a state sharing revenue problem. But there's revenues and there's expenses, and I'm sure there's things to do that we could do.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Dave.
The benchmark spending is the same thing, as I said, that takes a minute, so I'm probably going to spend some of the December, January break, and that could be included as a citation in the report too, so we can be fully upfront on benchmarking against our peers on the budget side. That'd actually get me ahead of our budget process in the spring, so we'll have it done already. So we talked about efficiencies and benchmarking, but I do want to make sure, outside of the points that I discussed, what further information do we want to talk about when we talk about services and expenses? This goes back to the first mandate, the first question, focus area, if anything. Objective 2 is progress on the facilities task force report. What we know to be true, our current budget for facilities maintenance is about a 0.5%. We've learned that the industry standard is 2 to 6%. The task force chairs in the report concluded don't throw good money after bad when they looked at the cost of maintaining and repairing what we have to its, I'd say 1970s condition is what I heard. So not an energy efficient modern facility or building new. And the costs for both were a wash. Public safety facilities are not standard, not to our standard in terms of accessibility, in terms of equity amongst our women and male employees. And that does hinder recruitment challenges. And we've learned that the staff has secured $2.1 million of outside grant funding for the future Martin Road Rec facility that is intended to replace some, not all, of the Kula Community Center dollars. The capital requests, here is just a list of those denials. So going back kind of, Dave, to your point, staff requested $2.4 million. I denied half of that, and we allocated 1.2 million. And a big sum of that 1.2 was for a grant obligation for Wilson Park, which is going to be done this spring. Don't throw good money after bad. This is the slide presented by the task force chair. This is a slide presented by the task force in their roll-up report on public safety facilities. It just summarizes the health, equity, and obsolescence issues that we learned from the tours. And this was presented actually in the capital improvement plan that the Planning Commission and City Council adopted in November as just two highlights of the capital plan. So the capital improvement plan is an annual process. We do it every fall, and it kicks off our budget process. It's a long-term capital asset forecasting requirement of the state. This is a state mandate for the city to adopt this through the Planning and Enabling Act. And so we do and in this case, we just call to attention two highlighted significant capital expenditure forecasts that are considered. And as I emphasized on Monday night's council meeting, this is a plan. This is not a budget allocation. So what is passed in the capital plan must be aligned with what is presented to council for budget capital requirements. If we are presenting major capital purchases to council that aren't in this plan, then we're in disalignment, and that's not what Ferndale does. Correct. So this is the example of the Martin Road Park facility. What I wanted to do is begin to, we've talked about the $2.1 million, and I wanted to make sure that we're thinking through the other side of that, because there's going to be, it'll be problematic for us to get 100% grant funding to pay for the cost of it. So there's going to be some debt service required to construct it. The concern then is when we talk about Headley and facilities, they do go together. So we don't want to build a rec facility and then if a Headley's not supported, we have staffing challenges. We don't want to build any facility where we can't staff the people inside the facility, right? So that's part of the things we want to think through. And I'd say I'll take the opportunity to talk about the Kula Community Center, because I know that this facility doesn't fully replace that. But it would be difficult to talk about renovating a Kula Community Center if we're not prepared to staff it. So those questions can't go together, because that Kula Community Center was a minimum $7 million to get it back to its an old antiquated standard. And it was $18 million to renovate. So that would be an extensive bond. In this case, you're looking at approximately $450,000 a year in debt service to finish a $5 million bond over 20 years. We'll go into that with the millage opportunities. The public safety headquarters. That too, this is really, these are imperfect numbers. This is based on the information we have at the time. The goal here is really just to illustrate there's an ongoing cost of debt service to build it, because we would likely bond for it, and bonding is just the government's way of borrowing money to pay for major capital, and it's repaid over an agreed upon amount of time of years. In this case, I suggested 30 years because the useful life of the facility should exceed 30 years. So 30 years is the longest we could bond. And so you can see if we had spent $25 million to construct this facility and we paid that back over 30 years, it would probably be about $1.5 million in debt service based on the inputs that I gave it. That can get refined on an annual basis with the more information we have. That gets us to objective 3, property tax implications. But before I move on, are there any questions about facilities? This is new information, example information about the public safety in the Martin Road Rec facility. Okay, so objective 3, property tax implications. This is not what we know to be true, what I just want to cover. You have a copy of a civics presentation I gave last spring in Ferndale, and it just gives a general overview of the different local government styles in Michigan and what's required of each, because they are different. Cities, villages, and townships, CVTs, all have different charters and different service mandates based on their charter. You could have a local charter if you're a home rule city like Ferndale, and a home rule city is described in that packet. And that just means that we are a city that's allowed to adopt local laws, local ordinances, and we're required to provide certain services that the county won't pick up for us or the state won't. And what that ultimately means is we have more local control. I won't go into detail, but that is all described there. I begin with that, the home rule city requirement, because the city has a charter, and the charter defines our operating millage at full can be 20. And that is pretty common across the state. That's coming from state laws. So in Ferndale, we're an older city, we have a 20 mil charter. Some newer cities, like Novi, for example. Novi was a township until I think the 70s, then it became a city. Since it incorporated later, they didn't start with a flat-out 20 mil general services charter. They might start, I don't know this precisely, but this is an illustration. They might have 10 for general operating, and then they would have 5 for public safety, and then they would have 2 for parks. So they created special purpose millages from the outset. Ferndale is an older city who has a general charter. We didn't do that, but Auburn Hills is in a similar situation. Any increase to that general operating millages, because we've learned about Headley rollback. So if the rollback continues from 20 as it has, and you're down to we're at 11 mills right now, the only way to get us north of that 11 mills would be by the vote of the people. Same for any facilities.
Through the chair. Just to confirm, though, by law, and I believe it's state law, we can never exceed 20 mils.
Correct.
Okay.
For general operating. So we wanted to look at options. These are some of the options that were laid out in the resolution, and then I've added more alternatives that could be considered. So option 1 is no millage renewal. The total budget reduction would be approximately $4 million. We've established that. The total operating millage, that would shift it down to 11.6355 by eliminating approximately 4 mills right now. So our current combined operating millages, which is our general operating millage, and the 2015 voter millage, is about 15.5 mills. And I'm using round numbers to simplify here.
Sorry to interrupt you, Joe. If you had to, this math is beyond me. I'd have to get out my calculator and figure it out. But so somebody who has a $100,000 home, and so the tax value is $50,000, that 4 mills, what would that represent? Or no one has a $100,000 home anymore. But I was just trying to think of as an example.
My finance director left. I
don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I think the equation, and I think it's actually in my Ferndale introduction, there's an equation how to figure out your taxes. And it would be your taxable value divided by 1,000 times the millage rate. It's a good rule of thumb. So 50,000 divided by 1,000 times 4 would be a really quick back of the napkin way to figure it out.
I got it. I was able to figure that out, Greg. Thanks. So $200 for every $100,000 of a home. So if someone's got a $200,000 home, it would be $400.
There you go.
Through the chair, I have just a quick clarifying question on the, so budget reduction of approximately 4 million, total operating millage 11.6355, and declining, right? So
Rolling back every year.
right,
Yeah.
so 11.6355 will be lower the next year and lower the next year and lower the next year.
Correct. Assuming that the rate of increase of the city's tax base is more than the inflation. Any facility investment would have to consider funding levels, staffing levels, and this is what I was talking about with the Martin Road Park and even public safety facility. I don't know that I would advise us to pursue building a public safety facility without supporting an operating millage. That would be, you would size it differently, right? Because your employee levels are going to be different without an operating millage. So in this case, if there's no millage renewal, we've rolled back our millage. Our operating millage is now 11 instead of 15 because we've cut about 4 mills. And with that 11 mills, we can't build these facilities with our current situation. So we certainly can't build facilities without any revenue. Does that make sense? Dale, you're looking at me like I'm crazy. No. Oh, okay. And this is all just this is an overture. We will go into more detail on property tax impacts in that formula next week. So property tax bills, yes, will be reduced with the elimination of the 2015 voter Headley override millage. Option 2 could be a partial Headley override millage. That's what I'm calling it. That is not what the state would allow us to call it on a ballot, to be clear. But essentially what a partial Headley override millage would be, you could, the Headley override could be for a mill amount. It doesn't have to restore you all the way to 20. So in this case, my option that I'm saying, a partial would keep you at your 4.5 today. And as soon as a millage is passed, if it's passed, it's subject to roll back the minute it's passed. So just to be clear, that 4.5 would get passed and it would start rolling back immediately. That would give you, if we stayed at 4.5, 15.99 mils. So this would sustain funding levels as they are. So when I say funding levels as they are, generally the services as they're laid out today would be what you could expect unless we found consolidating efficiencies or some other different way to provide those services, right? But generally, your government, as you know it today, would stay the same. This still would not fund new facilities. It would not fund a recreation facility. It would not fund a community center. It would not fund a public safety facility. This would be the budget we have today, which we can't do that with today's budget.
Through the chair, how do you get a partial Headley override?
I'm making that term up. Again, the state would kill me. I'm doing it for illustrative purposes. So a Headley override, a full Headley override, I'll talk about next, and then it might make sense. So your property tax bills would stay relatively the same today in this scenario. Any facility investments would need to be addressed through a separate millage, which we'll talk about in a moment. Is everyone following along with those first two? Option 3 would be a full Headley override millage. So that's taking you all the way back to your charter 20. In this case, we're at 11, and you're right at this point, the 2015 would expire. So in order to, a full Headley override would be 8.3645 mils, and that gets you back to your 20. This would sustain funding levels as they are, and this would enable facility investments per the task force report. Property tax bills would increase. If you looked at your tax bill and you looked at your current voter operating millage amount, it's at 4 mils. So practically, if that's in front of your face, you double that, and would be what you would expect the impact to be.
So, Joe, am I understanding correctly that option 1, no millage renewal, means that we would lose $4 million from the general fund?
Yes.
Option 2 means the general fund stays about where it is right now. And option 3, a full Headley override millage, would add about $4 million to the general fund? 4 million-ish.
That would be fair to say.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have more specific numbers next week. Now I want to cover facility. Oh,
Sorry,
Kimmy?
through the chair. So why does it say it would sustain funding levels as they are if it would increase by about 4 million?
Would sustain funding levels and enable.
I got you.
Yeah, I would suggest that it would be unwise of us to increase staffing levels and not address facilities. So facility bonds, what I would assume is a good baseline rule of thumb assumption for facilities, you would assume a 30-year millage term at a 5% interest rate. The benefit of using bonds to construct facilities is that it eliminates your upfront capital costs, which are quite exorbitant. So it smooths that cost out over time, over the course of 30 years, which can make it much more digestible to pay, much like a mortgage. The other benefit is the people who are paying taxes on that facility are benefiting directly from that facility. So that is a financial theory, that's in favor of bonding out. So a combined millage for public safety facilities and to finish the $5 million to build the rec center at Martin Road would be, I would guess, between 2 to 3 mils, based on what I know at this time, for 30 years. And I'll show the money next week in more detail. I want to plot that out for you. If you made it just public safety facilities, it'd be 2.5. That means we don't fund the rec center, and maybe that just waits until we can stack grant after grant after grant after grant, and over time, it'll get built. No public safety or just the rec center would be about a $500,000 to finance, $5 million over 20 years. And because I dropped that to 20 because that's a smaller amount, and we want to pay it off to save ourselves on the interest for a smaller bond like that. Special purpose millages. This is kind of what, as I described, Novi and Auburn Hills, those newer charter cities. This is kind of how they started. They didn't start with the general operating. They have different millages. Because our charters from 1927, it would need to be amended. So if, for example, the committee and council wanted to say, let's dedicate 5 mils to police and fire and restrict what can be used for general services, that would have to be voted on, the millage would have to be voted on, and it would also, to pass, would have to have a charter amendment that would say we want to amend our charter to reduce our general operating millage from 20 to 15 and dedicate 5 for police and fire. Those two have to go together. And Mike didn't catch that. He split. Never mind. So examples of special purpose millages that are pretty common to see: police and fire. Birmingham actually just passed the senior services millage in November. Recreation millages or just dedicated facilities millages. So Oak Park, I shared these examples previously, but Oak Park just passed this month a recreation facilities millage and recreation services millage. So they did that. They passed, I believe it was for a 20-year millage to fund the other half of a rec facility that they did secure some grant funding for. And then with that, they also passed a dedicated rec millage to fund staff to serve the facility. Both of those millages were for 20 years. And those passed a couple weeks ago. And then the facilities millage, interestingly enough, the city of Roseville just passed that in November as well. So they passed a general facilities millage that could create a millage to fund construction of new facilities, but also pay for the maintenance on existing facilities. The effects of special millages, generally they reduce discretion use of funds for other areas, and they secure funding for that special purpose. So as I said, you would reduce, right now your charter operating is at 20. If you dedicate that for a special purpose, you reduce your discretion you can spend on other areas because you're committing to one area.
My question, not mumble it under my breath. So so what you're saying is that 20 is 20 is 20. 20 is our max, regardless of whether we choose a special purpose millage. And I guess I'm wondering, if we have to ask for a charter amendment in order to do this, why can't we also have a charter amendment to increase our maximum? Not saying whether or not that's politically feasible. I'm just asking a question.
State law. The home rule city law caps you at 20.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So here's a couple. I just did an example of police and fire. So in this case, this scenario is no millage, the first one. No, it assumes a partial Headley, sorry. If the partial Headley were adopted and we did a charter amendment to restrict it to police and fire, you could see that's how that would shake out. So I rounded for simplicity purposes in fiscal '24, that would look like 11 operating and 5 for police and fire. And then, as we said, that rolls back. So the next year, I just tried to illustrate that that starts to roll back. The bottom one assumes there is no millage, but voters want a charter amendment to restrict and guarantee public safety. So that means there's a tax cut and we keep 11. That's our operating mills. We have 11 now. If there's a charter amendment, that means you reduce your funding for other areas to 6 mills, and you keep 5 mills dedicated for police and fire. Okay.
Does that maintain a current service level? I mean, I'm looking at a police and fire that doesn't fully cover police and fire. It means they're still pulling police and fire from the general fund, just less.
This, I haven't.
Police and fire cost more than
Sorry,
5
my
mils.
thought was just disrupted.
Sorry, police and fire. If I'm looking at, was that the fire chief that did that? No.
So it would be the mills. So honestly, I didn't do the calculation to project that out. I don't think, that would not cover our costs.
That
for
doesn't
police and
cover. Yes, so that
5
doesn't
mills
cover our
was
costs.
completely from my hip.
Okay.
I wanted to use just round numbers for illustration purposes.
Okay. Thank you.
Joe, can you talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs that might be in having, a single general fund the way that we do now, or a single millage versus special purpose versus general? Because I'm sure there's some benefits and I'm sure there's some costs to that, some trade-offs.
Well, the general benefit is you're reflecting your purpose charter. As we talked about, your charter cities have more local control. You can have more opinions on things, and you can have tailor-made services that are discretionary, but are the benefit of a charter. If you're a village or a township, most of your services are going to be rolled up to the county, so you have less control. For example, townships typically don't do their own local road improvements. They would wait for the county road commission to determine when to pave and improve their local roads. And so you're at the mercy of the county more so.
I think Quinn's question is, from Ferndale's perspective, right now you just have a general fund, you don't have special millages.
Yeah, I was going along, it was a long journey, so I'll cut.
We got 16 minutes, Joe.
Sorry, yeah. So to get to it, we're structured based on the city council strategic plan. So they place emphasis on infrastructure. So we have a robust public works department. We do a lot of road repaving. We do leaf collection, none of which is mandated. There's a lot of services we provide. A lot of our waste management, sanitation services, all home rule services. We're not required to provide them, but we're permitted to provide them should we pass local ordinances and local budgets that say this is what we want to do because we're a home rule city and we can do that. Some of our ordinances, we can regulate short-term rentals. Well, that takes a community and economic development department to oversee. Villages and townships don't have that. So really you lose discretion over some of those services. We probably stop doing some of those. We probably will have to suspend some of those ordinances or ask council to readdress some of those ordinances because we're not going to have the staff to enforce them or back them up.
So I'm just gonna nice round hypothetical numbers. So we are at 20 mils to start. That's our cap.
Mm-hmm.
And we say, okay, 15 mils for general operating and 5 mils for parks and rec. What are the costs, or what are the trade-offs associated with having parks and rec be a separate thing? I'm presuming that it has to do with less flexibility in terms of.
Yes. I'll go back to it. You reduce discretionary flexibility use of funds. So I'm locking in 5 mils on Parks and Rec. That's more than I'm spending right now on Parks and Rec. So they're living high over there in Incubizo. And I'm probably, they're probably not in Incubizo anymore at that point. And now we're reducing City Hall and Public Safety and anyone else that's not part of that Parks and Rec millage. So it's just a shifting of budget allocation and resources.
Okay, so it's,
And you can't transfer. They can't, once you adopt it, you adopt it. So no money shall be, no more or less shall be spent on Parks and Rec. It's got to be 5 mils. Well, you could do more. I mean, we could shift more and just keep adding on to it. But everything's a trade-off. It's
okay,
just,
so the benefit is that Parks and Rec knows that they have 5 mils. Again, random numbers I'm throwing out here. So they know they can spend that however, they are approved to do so. Because nobody else is going to say, well, I have a really important project. I need some of that money. That's theirs. And that's good for them. But everybody else has to kind of make do with what's left. And there's that tension there. While there's this other sort of group that has committed funding. So in a case for a facilities maintenance, that's good because we now know that there's committed money to maintain facilities, but it comes with decreased flexibility for all of the other programs. Am I?
that is 100% correct. And that was a facilities task force observation because there was, concern about disinvesting into new facilities. And they had said, well, what if we amend the charter to require, if we get a Headley override, that override is going to be committed to just facilities. And so now what that does is locks in your current service levels today. Well, we'll reduce, it's a long thing, but the bottom line is we have less discretion to spend on the other service areas.
Chair, I would imagine it could have long-term implications as well, where, if you start locking up funds for all these different specific purposes, longer term, as our city changes and people's needs and desires
Correct.
change, that could present problems down the road.
You become a more static budget. You're not as fluid or flexible if you want to shift and go all in on a certain area because your community's moved that way. You're going to be locking yourself in and you're not going to have that much flexibility to do that. So that's the con. The pro is that you lock in whatever your priority is.
And through the chair, the vision of the city and the project-based planning budgeting would also be better represented and or supported through a general fund, not a special millage.
Yeah, probably.
Through the chair, I had one other question. This is a little bit like higher level and beyond like specific to Ferndale, but I know we've talked about, how we, a large financial burden falls on us because so much of our property tax dollars go to the state and that doesn't come back to us. Is there any, to your knowledge, like pending legislation at the state level or anything that could impact this that might help us out in that regard?
The state gave us a legislative update earlier this year, about a year ago, that there was interest in addressing state shared revenue. And I haven't seen anything across the legislature yet. Kate, you might have.
I corner Jeremy Moss about this whenever I see him, because he was the sponsor in the Senate of the bill. So there have been bills introduced, I believe, in the Senate and the House to modify the way that state shared revenue is distributed. It would result in an increase for cities like Ferndale. To my knowledge, it hasn't moved out of committee in either chamber. I know that the Michigan Municipal League supports and encourages cities to advocate for both of them, but they certainly haven't come to the floor.
We have advocated, when I was contacted about it in the spring and summer, we communicated to support it through MML. But to Kate's point, it's tough for these bills, spending bills, to get out of committee. It just is. So I've learned to be an optimistic skeptic. Finally, the last millage option would be a Public Act 345, police and fire pension millage. It's a bit technical and a bit tricky, but it is an option. So what this would require is a ballot initiative to establish a permanent millage that funds annual police and fire pension contribution requirements and retiree health care related to those pensioners. So we have established that no matter what happens with the Headley override vote, we pay close to $3.5 million, $4 million a year in pension costs. So if we lose $4 million, that is inflexible money. I won't be able to cut there. I have to meet those obligations and contributions. So, knowing that that's true, one option would be, this would be equivalent to the Headley in value, but an alternative if there's not an appetite to do a Headley override for 4 mills, you could pass a Public Act 345 pension millage or put that to the voters. And that would essentially establish a new Public Act 345 pension system. Our current pension assets that we manage would be transferred over to this new system, and then in perpetuity, a police and fire pension millage would be assessed on tax bills, and that would always pay for contribution costs.
Joe, I had a question on that. Is that 3.5 million, it moves, right? It's not a fixed number. It's not always 3.5 million.
Sure.
It could be
It
slightly
depends on the
less, it could be
market.
slightly more depending on how the market's doing, because it's our, what is it, your required minimum
contribution,
pension fund,
which
right?
is determined by an actuary.
One year the market is just fantastic, and that could be $1 million, but not really. Like
Kind
it's
of. They
usually around 3.5 million.
They smooth out, they try to smooth out, so an actuary will tell you your expected liabilities,
Yeah,
and they'll take that out over a 5-year period, so the market isn't such an influence, and then they'll smooth it out over that. So it tries to be more predictable, but it's subject to market.
right, but so if they passed a millage for this, there could potentially be the scenario where we have more than we're required to contribute, right?
Could it earn more revenue?
No. I'm saying that the 4 mills that we're talking about right here, if our contribution was less, then we would have excess money sitting there, but it would be required to be used for.
Your millage would go down if your contribution was less. It would be,
Oh,
you would have to prove your obligation on an annual basis, so it creates more overhead on our end, because the statute is going to require that. This is a public
okay.
millage,
I
so.
thought that I caught we might have more than what we need, but then we have to use it for that reason, so we couldn't use it for something else at the city.
It's akin to a special purpose millage only for legacy costs. But it is a tool, and I said I would deliver all tools that I could, so. It's not subject to Headley rollback, which is interesting. So, you could also get a tax increase if the market is different, your contribution goes up. Our contribution has doubled since 2021.
Both of our police and fire DB plans are closed. Can this be opened to new beneficiaries?
Could be. The interesting thing about the state law is that the collective, once it's adopted, the collective bargaining contract
That's
controls
what I noticed.
the millage.
That's
the point
really
I wanted to make.
That's really interesting. Okay, that was the sentence I was wondering about.
This was one of the more fascinating research categories I've had with, and I talked to the TIF attorney and multiple attorneys actually to understand this. So the complexities, the complexities is it would require us to close our current police and fire system. Simply, it's really just a transfer of assets and liabilities to this new system defined by the millage. We would have to amend the charter to get rid of the board and establish a new board aligned with Public Act 345. You obviously have to educate retirees and bring them along with you. So this one is much more complicated, but there are cities that have done it. And this is just an example of how that would play out on a table. It looks very familiar like today's millage. It's not a general operating millage, it's restricted to pension. So there's an example of the effects. Did I leave any time?
There are 5 minutes. Any last questions? The good news is the entirety of the next meeting is dedicated to understanding these options. So this isn't your last time, but we'll take questions quickly.
Sorry, I just actually have one at the request of Councilmember Kat Brunner James. She wondered why we haven't discussed a city income tax.
I don't know that we have enough large enough employers to make that viable.
She said it's really the only progressive option. Many of these other taxes are regressive, and she was curious as to why it hasn't been explored. I asked Councilmember-elect Johnson about it because they do have a city income tax in Detroit. His sort of broad observation, so I don't want to take this as gospel, was that sometimes in smaller cities it costs more to administer than you would get back. But I know that Councilmember Brunner James was very interested in hearing a little bit more about a city income tax option as a revenue option.
I haven't studied it in depth. My perception is it's a lot, you to be sustainable, I think you have to have some economic magnets. But Battle Creek does.
So I think I'm hearing a request for just
Yep, I
a
can-
high level.
I
We'll
can
take
follow up
that
on
as
that.
an action item, Kate. Yep, good. Yep, other last minute requests? Questions? Okay, so what I want to do is turn your attention to the proposed timeline. We have, depending on how you count, 6 more meetings. The next meeting will be a deep dive into these revenue options. So, reflect on what you learned today, bring good questions. Feel free to send questions in advance. That's always helpful so we can tailor the content to what you're thinking and what you're wondering about. And then we hope to be at a place where we can begin sharing opinions and perspectives. It's really easy to say, are there anything we can just take off the list? I think, you'll recall this, Dale and Quinn, from when we did the facilities. There are a few things there was just consensus on altogether. So very quickly, we may have a few things we have consensus on altogether. And then there may be some early opinions about, which way we're leaning. And the question that will be posed to you at that point, if not sooner, maybe at the end of the next meeting, will be, what additional information do you need in order to have an opinion? So you don't need to know the answer to that question now, but it will become the question that we need to ask ourselves in order to help us refine and get to a place where we have a singular, hopefully, recommendation. So the 14th would be beginning that process. The 4th would likely be following up on some of those information requests that you identify on December 14th. So January 4th, continue working toward consensus, hoping to seek consensus on a recommendation by January 11th. And then January 18th would be a bit of the logistics for, okay, so now we know what we want to recommend. Now we need to start talking about how do we write it down in such a way? What are the logistics around communicating it in the recommendation, the written recommendation that you make? Who's going to actually write it? Quinn helped last time. Are there people who are going to write it? What is going to be the review and approval process? And then we will likely have a final meeting where we have the almost complete draft. There might be a few last questions that we need to talk through as a group so that everybody's comfortable with the content. And that would be that final meeting. It's just we have the draft in front of us. There's maybe 2 or 3 questions that we haven't solidified. So the 2 suggestions that are not reflected in that timeline that have been raised are Quinn's suggestion of looking through the programs to consider possible expense cuts. And I think the desired outcome there is just to get a feel for, if we were to go with option 1, what would that look like? What would that feel like? So that's one possible additional activity in a meeting as homework. Quinn, do you have additional suggestions?
I would say that to me, that looks like an Excel spreadsheet that we can sit at home and noodle on and say, yes, this, no, that, and then kind of sum everything up and see where we land. And then, maybe we could share out what that looks like for us in the meeting, but not actually do the exercise altogether.
Yeah, Dave.
I was gonna say, in order to do that, though, we would have to know what the alternative is, right? Like I'd said earlier, we'd have to know what so like if we're gonna take something out, sometimes there's an additional cost to what that alternative
Yeah,
is.
the interconnectivity question.
That's right. So like,
Yeah.
just going back to my example again, which is just an example, just an example. Emergency medical services, that's listed as a 4, and it's $1.3 million.
Right.
Just as an example, I don't have the numbers in front of me. What would the alternative look like?
Right.
What would it be 1.3, or would it be, you'd have to know that, right? In the Excel file that you're talking about?
In a best case scenario, yes. At the level, because we are not city council, right? Like, we're not going to make that decision. I think kind of going with the expenses and the revenue that we have at the level that we have is probably a good starting place. Because we might, in order to have all of the nuanced information, we may not be able to get that in a timely
I'm just
manner.
saying, just taking something out on a line item to come to the 3.5 million, it doesn't really work. It doesn't seem like.
I have an idea. So, working with lots of groups, there's always different styles in terms of how people process information, come to their own conclusions. We could make it available for those of you who would find that helpful and not require anybody who, we have, for example, this framework analytical processor. Some people need additional, they're not, my husband is not comfortable telling me his favorite ice cream flavor. He's like, well, if there are sprinkles, then I want vanilla. But so like he would never, like he couldn't even begin. Because he'd be like, I need 50,000 more hours to be able to answer that question. And other people like me are like, I like chocolate. Oh yeah, I like mint chocolate chip too, and I really like it, but like, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? It's a favorite ice cream. So could we do that? Could we provide it? And then if it would be an activity you find useful, by all means, and we can certainly use that as our icebreaker. If you did this activity, what was your experience? And if it doesn't help move your thought process along, then by all means. Does that seem like good? Okay. We will do that. Thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Dave, I appreciate that you are willing to disagree with each other in such a kind and respectful way, because that is why we exist.
I'm not disagreeing
Yeah,
with.
yeah, sure. Just
I'm not
offering
disagreeing, I'm
varied
just suggesting
perspectives.
that
Yes.
Just taking things out,
Sure.
that's doom or gloom, and you can't look at the alternative.
Sure.
Sometimes the alternative is not
Yep.
yes or no.
Different.
That's all.
Yep.
That's my point.
Okay. And then, Alvita, I think you mentioned on the email the idea of a residential survey. And I'm also conscious that there was a residential survey. We haven't talked about it. So I just want to have a brief conversation.
Yeah, thank you. We did have Cobalt Community Survey. I don't know if any of you were selected. It was randomized. So I don't know the results, but I will get draft results in the next week or two from the company, and we'll present those results to the 18th. So the survey is more focused on general comments and opinions of city services. But there was a question in there, knowing what you know today, if there was a vote, yes or no. And so it's just really a general litmus test.
Okay.
If
So
anything-
maybe we start with learning of that, and then we ask the question of ourselves. Okay. Is there anything else at this point you would hope to cover at the next meeting or would like to suggest?
All right. There are no members of the public present in the audience today that I can see. Nobody's waving. Okay. So I need then a motion to adjourn. Motion by Kyle and seconded by Dave. All in favor? All right. We are adjourned at 8:04. Thank you.